So the next topic I would like to talk about is the EU single market. As I explained in my last video, it will be very, very difficult for the UK to get access to the single market without having to make some concessions, such as, again, accepting free movement of people or contributing to the EU budget. And so there's not really much point in doing a deal like that if you end up still with the same stuff that you have today. So one idea that the Brexit side has, and is now more and more propagating, is to say, you know what, screw you, we don't need the EU single market. We can be outside, free, and still trade with the EU, but also trade with the rest of the world like everybody else does. For example, and they name examples like Canada is not in the EU single market, Australia is not in the EU single market, and still is doing well, trades with the EU. Where is the problem? Why can't we do the same thing? Now, what is the fallacy about this? The fallacy is that, of course, all these countries are not in Europe. And that matters, of course, because Australia has only 5% of its exports going to the EU. Canada has only 9.5% of its exports going to the EU. I mean, of course, these countries don't need to have the best possible access to the EU because they don't trade that much with the EU. The situation, of course, is not the same for the UK, which has 45%, so almost half of its exports going to the EU. And you know, so of course it's a completely different situation if you're a European country than when you are on the other side of the globe. And geography matters. Countries tend to trade more with their neighbours than with countries far away. And that's also the reason why the Commonwealth is not really of much use, because you're not going to trade more with around the world if all countries always trade more with their neighbours for reasons of culture, language, transport costs, and that's a pattern you can observe all over the world. For example, Canada, whilst it doesn't care about the EU, the United States is absolutely their most important market. They have 75% of their exports going to the United States of America, and by consequent, they are in the North Atlantic Free Trade Agreement. So Canada has the best possible access to their biggest market. Australia doesn't have that because there is nothing like the EU in Asia, but if there was, you can be sure that Australia will be part of it, because the Asian neighbors are all important for their exports, in particular China. So we have to look at what really works for European countries, because we are in Europe. We're not going to change that. And in Europe, you don't see a single wealthy country that is not in the single market. If you leave, you would be the only wealthy Western European country outside the single market in Europe. And the only other country that tried that was Switzerland in the 90s. And as I explained, when we did that, we had a very nasty recession. And we were so fed up with it that at the end we signed that deal, which gave us access again, but where we had to accept all the things that you want to leave the EU for. So it seems there is no real model or no real example that you could follow, because nobody has done successfully what you're trying to do, which is being in Europe but being outside the single market. Now, that's of course great, but we would like to understand why is that? Why is this bloody single market so important? And I would like to explain that. I mean, there's several reasons, but the single market is very unique in the world in its scale and its depth as well. So first of all EU countries have completely abolished tariffs between themselves. So the single market, all single market member countries have no tariffs anymore between them. If you leave the single market, it's not that bad in terms of tariffs, so you will not get, you know, like suddenly suffer like 20% or 30% tariffs or some crazy thing like that. And that's because you will fall back on the World Trade Agreement, the World Trade Organization agreement. You're also a member of that, and the EU is also a member of that. So the tariffs will be limited at, you know, most of them are below 5%, and a lot of them are, you know, around 1 or 2%. So there's a ceiling that all the member countries have agreed that they will not go beyond with each other when charging tariffs. But there's two problems with that. A, there are some industries that even if they have small tariffs applied would be vulnerable because they're very price sensitive. So for example, if your car exports would going to the UK would suddenly be charged with 5% tariffs. Now, your car industry is actually an amazing success story. I mean, you know, some time not long ago, you had almost no car industry. And then, because foreign companies invested in car plants in the UK in order to export to the European market, you had suddenly a massive growth of your car exports. And today, your car industry is bigger than France's, even though there's almost no British car company anymore. But because all the foreign companies liked putting factories to the UK, you have now a car industry again. Now, if you put yourself into the head of a manager of Hyundai or General Motors who thinks about, you know what, I want to build a plant in Europe to build cars for the EU market, I mean, where are you going to place your factory? Are you going to place it into a country which is going to be slapped with 5% tariffs? I mean, why would you do that? So these managers will then rather look at Ireland, Slovakia or other places where they could as well put their car factory, and they will. Probably your existing car industry will not disappear that quickly because it's already there, but the cars you export are very price sensitive. I mean, they're not high-end cars, so it could cost a few jobs as well. And certainly there will be no more growth in your car industry. And that would be a pity because these are really valuable industry jobs of which is exactly where you have not enough of. Another point that is, of course, that even though the tariffs are small, because you have such an integrated supply chain across Europe, they will add up. So when you have, for example, when Rolls-Royce produces a turbine that they export to China, there are hundreds of suppliers across the EU which deliver parts for this turbine, and some of these parts have been composed by other parts where there are suppliers again, and so certain items are crisscrossing across the UK border because one supplier in Slovakia delivers something to the UK, then the UK makes a part, sends it to Germany, Germany sends it to France, combines it with a part from there, brings it back to the UK, and so it crosses the UK border several times. So if every time now you have tariffs being charged, that will add up to the final cost of the turbine. So having tariffs again will not only hurt your chances to export to the EU, but they will also hurt your chances exporting to other countries, because you're at a massive disadvantage compared to your European neighbors who have the full supply chain, the full range of products of the entire single market at zero tariffs at their disposal to build their products. And for you, that will be more expensive. Then the next reason why the single market is so important is something which is actually always criticized, and that's regulation. Now, I mean, 99% of what the EU does is very dull, technical product and market regulation. Like they specify what are the safety features of a toaster that have to be in place so that it can be sold in the single market, or what are the chemicals that are allowed to be used in a halogen lamp, you know. Now, if you left the EU, of course you would have the chance to do your own regulation, but the problem is what's worse than red tape is 28 different red tapes. So if there was no single regulation in the single market, whenever a company wants to export something, it has to understand the regulation of the relevant country. And then if it wants to export to the next country, it has to understand another regulation again. And it even may have to change some features of its products depending on the market it exports to. And that's why the 28 countries decided to outsource and centralize all this product and market regulation in one institution, which is the EU. So, and that makes sense because now a company, once it has understood the regulation, it can export to 500 million consumers. And it's not just understanding the regulation, it's also getting your product approved, because you have to prove that your product is respecting the regulation of the market, and for that you have to register it, and you have some paperwork to do. Now you do that once, and then you can export to 500 million consumers and you're done. If you are outside, your companies will not only have to understand potentially two sets of regulation, so your own national regulation, and then once they decide to export the EU regulation, they will also have to go through a lot of additional paperwork. And the same is true for countries wanting to export to the UK. So there will be a lot of companies which will say, you know what, it's too much hassle. I'm not going to bother with that special UK regulation. I will just leave out the UK. I mean, it's a bit like with the phone apps, the smartphone apps. I mean, everybody who writes an app makes it for iPhone, and everybody makes it for Android. But should we bother to make it for Windows Mobile? It's a small market, not worth it. Let's just leave it. And the EU market is, I mean, it's 5 times bigger than the UK, and there will be a lot of companies that will not want to go through the hassle to also respect your own local regulations. Now, of course, you can keep the same regulations as the EU, but then what's the point of leaving the EU if you anyway follow the regulation? And you will still have to go through the paperwork. You will still have to register your product once in the UK, and then also have to have separate paperwork for the EU market. And the last point is, when you leave under WTO rules, you have no agreement on services, and this is probably going to be the most painful part of it, because the UK is extremely strong in exporting services to Europe and to the world. For example, I mean, in financial services, the UK is crushingly dominant in Europe. I mean, there's nobody even getting close to the volume and sophistication of the UK as a financial center. You can say the UK is Europe's New York. You know, you're the Wall Street of Europe. And that's not just true for financial services, also for other services, for law, consulting, for advertising, media, there's insurance, there's loads of services that you're very good at selling across Europe. 40% of our multinational service companies have their headquarters in London. I mean, this is amazing what a position that you have in this area. Now, if you leave the EU, you cannot offer your services anymore to your EU customers. So, for example, today, when a German bank, a German company buys a Swedish company, for example, you have typically a UK-based investment bank advising this German company, and the German company pays fees to that investment bank for doing so. These fees get booked in the UK-based investment bank as profits and generate a tax revenue for HMRC directly. The banker is probably living in the UK and is paying taxes to HMRC. So the entire revenue flows directly to the UK and profits the UK government and the UK population because there's additional demand. Now, if you leave, you can't do that anymore. You will have to offer your services through a subsidiary inside the EU. So this investment bank would have to open an office in Frankfurt, Dublin, Paris, Luxembourg, somewhere inside the EU, and would have to offer its services through this office. And the fees that are generated are then first booked in the subsidiary as a profit. And so the country, wherever that subsidiary is, will take a share of that profit via taxes, and only then what is remaining is maybe then booked in the UK. And worse, you will have slowly jobs diffusing to the continent, because this subsidiary needs, of course, people that are competent to do these deals. And these offices will grow and grow, and slowly there will be somewhere, the financial center of Europe will probably slowly grow somewhere else. I mean, the single market, the EU single market, is as integrated today almost as the United States in terms of trade. You can imagine, I mean, taking out the UK of Europe, it's as if you took New York out of the United States. Of course, it will be bad for the US to lose its financial center, but it would be catastrophic for New York, because it would have lost its whole hinterland that it's servicing. And you can imagine intuitively what would happen is that, you know, the financial center would not stay in New York. It would move to, I don't know, Chicago or somewhere else inside the United States, but it would certainly not stay in New York. And the same is true for the UK. I mean, the UK financial center, you know, the UK is not big enough to have such a huge financial center, so it's mainly because you are the European financial center or even the global financial center, and you need that hinterland of Europe that you're servicing to make you big. And if you're out of that, I don't see how that's not going to affect your your financial center. And it's not just bankers that will be concerned by that, but it will be also everybody who, because these bankers, obviously, they go to restaurants, they order pizza, they buy stuff, they buy cars. So everybody will be concerned by if these jobs go away and move to the continent. So, and that's why so far what has been observed in countries is that the single market is really extremely important in Europe. Countries who try to be outside have suffered. Countries who joined it have had always a boom immediately after joining the single market. So you have the evidence, the practical evidence of countries here. You have all experts, from the IMF, from World Trade Organization, Treasury, Bank of England, and 95% of all economists say that leaving the EU is a bad idea. And on the other hand, you have Nigel Farage and Boris Johnson. And they just say, no, it's going to be fine. It's going to be fine. Believe me, it's going to be fine. And it seems a lot of people would rather believe these two guys than all the evidence and all the opinions by pretty much everybody in economics. And it's astonishing, and I think Boris and Nigel will be deeply moved by your absolute and blind trust in their words.